Hello, guys. It's Orezup from Ukraine, from actually the hottest spots in the world right now. And when many people look at the war on Ukraine, they might think that it's only about Ukraine and Russia. But if you take a look on the wider perspective, you actually will see that the entire world is involved into this, and the history of the next generations is being written now here in Ukraine. So I would like to give like some step even further and lift up the issue that some people might consider the war in Ukraine the extension of the Cold War, which supposed to be finished over than like 30 years ago. And in order to examine this allegation, I would like to invite for this conversation a person who knows a lot actually about the Cold War, Professor Darin Gerdes from America, from University of Charleston. And Mr. Gerdes, hello, nice to see you.
How are you? It's good to see you again.
Absolutely. For those people who'll be watching this interview, I would like just to tell you that we met with Mr. Gerdes like over a month ago, and our first meeting happened actually on your channel, where we're talking about events in Ukraine. So before you continue watching this video, I would like to invite you go over now to the channel of Mr. Gerdes. The link is down below, and check out his videos about like combat events in Ukraine and about the analytical approach what's actually happening around this war. So nice to see you. Thanks for showing up. It took us some quite time to arrange the meeting, but I'm very happy that now we are able to speak about the topic. And can you tell me like what did you like when I invited you to this interview? And I told that our topic would be examining the possible extension of the Cold War. Was it surprising for you? Like, did it ever come to your mind from the American perspective that the current war is closely related to the major, this confrontation in the 20th century?
Sure, that's one of the prevailing theories. Like everybody's trying to figure out, like, why did Putin do this, right? And so some people will say, well, the Donbass is rich and there's reserves there, or if he can just cut off the Black Sea, he can have all the oil in the Black Sea, or maybe there's the path across Ukraine. The West couldn't be stopped if they could control Ukraine, or there's all kinds of things. I don't know that that's it. But I want to back up from where you started with. It's an extension of the Cold War. I don't think it's an extension of the Cold War, but it's very familiar, right? It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar, and you can see those similarities. I want to back up to when you talked to Johnny the other day. So you had this interview with Johnny Pierce. You were talking about the Great Game and
Exactly.
Crimea, right? Now, I did a whole episode on Crimea where I was talking about, like, look, you got to understand the importance of Crimea in world history. Like, it changed hands over and again, but the Crimean War, what you didn't talk about, was what happened next. So the battle's over, the war is done, Russia's broke. And what did it do? It sold because of Crimea, it had to sell some land. It didn't sell Crimea, it sold Alaska. Okay. Think about the geopolitical implications of what just happened. It sold Alaska to the United States for a song. And a century later, that changed world politics. Because imagine if nuclear weapons were pointed from Alaska just over the border down to the lower 48, it would have been a game changer. So these things have consequences. Now, in the same way, think about how the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. So I was a senior in high school in 1991, going to college. In the ride on the way to college, like in the car with my parents, I'm hearing on the radio about the coup on Gorbachev, right? Like that's what's in the news that day while I'm right. And so I'm hearing about this and I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And it falls apart. Why did it fall apart? Well, what preceded it for the decade? The war in Afghanistan. That costly war caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so now here we are again, where like what the Russians lost in about 3 months in Ukraine would be equivalent and killed soldiers of what they lost in a decade in Afghanistan. I mean, this is terrible for
People
Russia,
don't
right?
realize, right, how huge the conflict now. Yeah.
Oh, and I don't think Putin would have done it if he knew like this was how it was going to be. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But I'm stunned when I'm looking at this. So it's not the Cold War, but it's something else, and it's very similar. Putin has this mentality of it's us against the West, right? But it's not us anymore. It's just him. Like us would have been in the Cold War would have been Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and all the Eastern Bloc states that are now with the West. And why? So he likes to make this argument, for example, about like, well, the West keeps encroaching. The West isn't encroaching. The analogy I give is you're a big bad biker dude, and you get this girlfriend, and you're kind of slapping her around. And at her first opportunity, you're at a restaurant with her. At her first opportunity, she sees the football team, and she runs into the arms of the biggest, baddest football player she can find, and she's like, "No, I'm with him now." And he's like, "No, I want really bring it." Right. And so that's kind of what it's not that NATO is encroaching west. It's that the Baltics, the Poland, Ukraine wants to join. All these states are going into the arms of protection from who are they running from? From you, Russia. I mean, exactly. so that's a better analogy than that the West is moving or that the NATO is moving east.
So, that's very interesting because the objective of Russia is to move the NATO borders further west from. And I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, this is like the survival war. If you ask my friends who are here, I have many people in the front line. They're like, this is our war. It's our holy war for survival and so on. But what is it from the American perspective? Stakes are very high. United States is the single biggest donor in terms of finances and armor, like more than every other party combined. Like, what's your skin in the game here?
Okay, let me first ratify your statement that it is Ukraine's war for independence. We see that pretty clearly, and we're looking at it going, Putin's going to become Hitler if we don't do something. Like, we were asleep at the wheel in 2000. Okay, so 2004. Let's go back to that. You know what happened in 2004 with the election, and
sorry to interrupt you. For those people who probably don't know what happened in 2004, there was an Orange Revolution in Ukraine when people revolted against the fake elections. And as you were like a teenager during 1991 when the Union collapsed, I was 16 years old, and I remember myself very, very clearly actually being on Maidan, on the Freedom Square, staying together with all the protesters. Basically, I was there. I remember it very well. Yeah,
that's amazing. Yeah, so 2004, we're like, what's going on over there? 2008 in Georgia, I remember being like, dude, somebody's got to do something here. That, like, why aren't we doing something about Georgia? Like, this is not. So in my master's thesis in public, I have a master's in public policy and an MBA, and then my PhD in org leadership, right? So in my master's thesis, I've looked at the Nazis, right? How it was actually how the process whereby life can become by law non-life and be killed, right? Like, what are the steps that went through that process? But I'm looking at what Hitler did, and Hitler did the pretext, just like Putin was working on, like, oh, they're attacking Germans. Okay, that wasn't actually what's going on. But Hitler said somewhere along the way that if he had been stopped in his first step, he wouldn't have gone any further. So we've kind of created Putin by allowing him to not be checked. So in 2004, now Putin on his side, he's convinced that the CIA is behind 2004, and then in 2014, and he's convinced that because he's a KGB guy, there's no phrase like a liar doesn't believe anyone else. Right, because that's how he would do it. He's convinced that that's what's going on. I don't think that's what's going on, but that's how he sees the world. Okay, so 2004, nothing. 2008, nothing. 2014, still nothing. And at this point, America's starting to wake up and go, that's not right. Whoa, something's got to be done about that. But also Ukraine was waking up to this and going, we got to start arming ourselves because more is coming. And the U.S. military started working more hand in hand with Ukraine. And so you'll start to see more of that interconnection over that last 8 years, because Putin was coming for more. And you could just tell, it's like, a bully doesn't pick on, like he's talking about, like they can't join NATO. A bully doesn't pick on the biggest, baddest football player. He picks on the guy that he thinks he can beat up. And this is proof that Ukraine should be in NATO, because the only reason that Russia is attacking Ukraine right now is because they're not in NATO. Like he wouldn't have picked on him if it wasn't like so. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm not sure I even answered your question. I just kind of
must say it took quite some time for you guys to wake up.
It did. It's unfortunate.
Still, it's unbelievable that Ukraine withstood all of those difficulties. And now things are leaning towards our successful counteroffensive with all the military support what is coming.
Yeah.
But still, we can go from the level of morals, of values. Let's dive down a little bit to more cynical and some calculation. Definitely America is probably interested to participate in this war. Russia is the only historical enemy of United States which openly tells this, right? So it's beneficial for United States to be involved into Ukraine and to play an decisive role in here. And definitely probably there are some plans for the future. Can you elaborate on that, please?
So let me go back to, in my video 2 days ago, I said my values, because I was talking about Zelensky's speech before the in Westminster Hall in UK. I said, hey, see how he's talking to their values? My values compel me as an American to support Ukraine, because look, you're a democracy. You're trying to live these democratic values. You're being attacked by unmercilessly from this authoritarian state next door that wants to dominate. Not only take out the part that they're a historic enemy, that's just unjust right there. Okay, but again, I want to make sure I'm making this clear too. I take nothing away from Ukrainians and say, well, it's Americans that are you guys are the pointy edge of the spear, and if you're going to stand up and fight, man, we got to equip you. We better be doing that. Otherwise, what are our values? What are our ideals? It's all talk if we don't do that. So I think that we're tied together with this common enemy in a different way. But so think back to Afghanistan. The Afghanis, we trained the Afghanistan police and military, and then they ran away. They didn't want to fight. You guys wanted to fight, right? You saw the existential threat and were like, bring it. Can I have some weapons? I'm going to take it to them. And when Zelensky said, I need ammunition, not a ride, I think that changed the entire trajectory of it's not that it's just him. There's something in the Ukrainian psyche that's very different than the Russian psyche. The way that Ukrainians think about freedom and the way that they think about their independence, as opposed to the, beat down zombie likeness of Russian population that can say, they were interviewed, 1420 was doing this interview. Well, what do you think about these people, these high ranking people falling out of hotel rooms? And they're like, well, people fall out of hotel rooms everywhere. No, that's not. No. They're mentally beat down, and to the point where they just can't even think for themselves about hey, this might not be right. It's a very different thing than where you are mentally. So from 1994, where you started departing and went very different directions, and I think to not support Ukraine is just it's repudiating our values. What it would be.
I see. And also, in the practical perspective, I think Ukrainians have proved that they really apply a good using of this weapon that you are sending. They really use it efficiently, right?
There was an anonymous Pentagon official that said on a scale of 1 to 10, the Ukrainians are a 12 militarily. That's awesome.
I can tell you, in Ukraine, there is a joke that's very soon NATO will want to join Ukraine also.
That's funny. That's good stuff. And there's a reason for it. You guys have been showing yourself very well. And yeah, you just don't have the support, and I don't fault you for not having the support. Go back to 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum. And like, it was the US, the EU, the US, the UK, and Russia that guaranteed your borders, and Russia's aggressing against it. So, I mean, you had that confidence. By the way, think about Russia. If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, who would they be? Like, think about it. Russia has the population of 130 million. It's about the size of America's 5 or 6 largest states. That's about it, right? That's not that big. They're a fraction of the
economy. It's less than Texas.
Less than Texas by a long shot. Less than Texas, and that's like, who do they think they are? So they really have this kind of. So let's get into the psyche of it. So I said it's like the Cold War, but it's not. They have this kind of like, we're still part of this bipolar world thing, but there's no bipolar world. There's that kind of fell apart, and half of that bipolar world was all the Eastern Bloc states that now ran the NATO. And China might be there, but if China's going to work with you, they want to be the big brother. You do realize that, Putin, right? I mean, they're going to be the big part. So it was like Russia was up here, and then China was down here. And over time, Russia has degraded itself, where China is actually going to be kind of the leader over on that side of the world. I think the longer this goes on, the more that's going to be true.
If like we touch the topic of Cold War that we actually started with, I think at the moment the capacity of Russian Federation is way lower in absolute terms, and also in the comparison terms, as it used to be like 30-40 years ago. So basically now is, even on these results within Ukraine, they cannot provide any result. Not even talking about something on a global scale, as for me.
Yeah, the Russians really pants themselves in front of the entire world. I mean, it's really amazing. Like the joke, you've probably heard it, was that they were second strongest army in the world, now the second strongest army in Ukraine. Have you heard that? You haven't heard that one? That's pretty good. Maybe third after Wagner. I don't know. We don't. It's they're really. I mean, they really have not shown themselves to be very strong. And a lot of this is the corruption that has gone on for years. That has kind of hollowed things out, and nobody was really talking about it. But they were okay with doing that. But when it comes to time to fight, the proof's in the pudding.
Absolutely.
So
how do you think it will develop? Like, because I have some of my scenarios in mind, and I will keep them to talk after you, but at the moment we are at the stage when there was kind of like a stalemate in the east of Ukraine, but at this very moment Russians are moving forward, half a kilometer a day in the east. We are still waiting for the delivery of like hundreds of tanks that should arrive to Ukraine. Like, how do you think it will develop in the nearest time, and let's say in the foreseeable future?
Okay.
In general, in Ukraine, in the region,
I think it's critical that Ukraine holds the line for the next 2 months. This is your most dangerous time, from what I can tell. I'm not a military guy. I'm looking at the leadership aspects of whatever. That's my understanding. But if you can hold on until you get your tanks, a lot changes, and then Russia has to make some calculations it doesn't want to make. So the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, put something out about 5 days ago where they were talking about Putin. And Putin's not what you think he is. Putin likes to show you that he's this tough guy. He's running around shirtless, wrestling bears, scoring all the goals in the hockey game. Like, think about the hockey game. That's almost a perfect metaphor. Who's going to keep him from scoring? Right? It's all staged theatrics, but he's not really that good. He's not really that tough. He's kind of scared. He's hiding under great security in Moscow. When he comes out wearing a flak jacket. He has body doubles. I mean, he's not the big bad tough guy that he is. Zelensky went to the front lines. Zelensky went out of the country now twice. I mean, there's a big difference between those two characters. Putin is actually far more risk averse than you think he is. And so when you look at this, he's saying do these great things, but he's not providing his people with the means that they need like his military with the means that they need to actually perform their task. He's not providing them with the munitions that they need, and they're running low. He's not providing them with the manpower. Now, if he provides them with the manpower, he could have a political problem. See what happened with the first wave of partial mobilization. Remember, when he invaded, there was nothing to see here. This is just a special military operation, right? Okay, so and now it's become an existential threat. Now, existential threat, really? That's
I see. I hope also that you and many people who are watching this from the Russian perspective understand that, realize that it's not only about Putin. Like, Putin is not the single driving force of this war. There is a collective Putinism, you know, and
yeah, there's an authoritarian mindset. So it's not just Putin, but Putin has a distinctive mindset that is part of the. So it could have happened with somebody else, and we don't know who the next person's going to be and how they're going to act. So that authoritarian mindset drives it, but Putin has this distinct flavor of it, right?
Okay.
So that's why I keep saying Putin, Putin, Putin. So
even the most liberal Russians are still in large extent and anti-Ukrainians, you know.
Yep.
Even like Navalny, who is like the biggest profile opposition leader in Russian Federation, when he was directly asked like what you're going to do with Crimea, are you going to give back Crimea to Ukraine if supposedly you become the president? He responded like, Crimea is not a sandwich to flip it back and forth, you know. So so even like, let's say Ukraine wins this war and something happens to Putin, we still have 140 million people in Russia who believe that Ukraine should not lean where it's going now, which is to the West. And this problem is existential in general.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the Russians are profoundly racist against Ukrainians. I mean, profoundly. They're the genocidal acts that they have taken, and that the Russians are like, I mean, this is what happens, right? I mean, they don't care. They're okay with that. There is a deep empathy gap between what a normal human being should be doing toward his neighbor and what they're doing toward Ukraine. So it's not just Putin himself. There is this culture within Russia that is like that, and I don't know what you'd get out of another leader, but I do know that this is who we're dealing with at the time. I don't see them slowing down, or the Russians slowing down. I see Putin having to double down because he doesn't want to be the guy that loses, because so he'll do whatever he has to do to stay in power, is what I'm saying. So in partial mobilization, you had 300,000 or more mobilized, and you had a million men flee the country. By the way, people don't like me when I say this, but I think this is an important point. I'm glad that those million men have fled the country. I don't see any scenario where they're so beaten down that they're going to rise up in the streets and oppose Putin. It's just not realistic. I would like that to happen. I think in Ukraine that would happen, because you have something different in your DNA there. That's something like 2004, 2014 proved that you guys have grasped that, and they just don't get it. They just like, they're so apathetic. They're just so, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like they're drones.
One of the biggest differences between Ukrainian national psyche and Russians, you know, when Ukrainians don't like something, we just, you know, stand still, we revolt, change the government, and stand like build to our values, right? And but Ukraine and Russia were sharing a lion's share of culture even after 2014. So, for example, many Ukrainians are native Russian speakers, you know, and many pop stars, many like celebrities, even Zelensky himself before 2014 was happily performing, you know, in Russian Federation, who is like also a native Russian speaker. So basically, like singers, you name it, they were equally popular. Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, in like this Russian-speaking sphere of influence. And when the current invasion actually started, all these Ukrainian-speaking celebrities, they started spreading the message to their audience, which was like 50-40% based in Russia, telling like, look, your government is sending rockets to my home. Do something about this. And like there was a big campaign, people with like millions of followers zero acceptance, zero response, So from that point, many Ukrainians are pissed on good Russians. Why didn't you revolt? Why did you just leave?
Yeah.
Because if like we were in tough situation, we always like, even with the risk of being shot, of being killed, people still revolt. There, nothing happened, and this is very, very disappointing. And
Yep. So I look at that situation. I would like them to revolt, but I don't believe that they will. I don't think they have it in them to do this after however many, because essentially they had the Soviet system and then they had an authoritarian part two that has become more and more authoritarian, where you've gone the other direction. And so they're still kind of steeped in that. I don't see it now. That million, largely men that have gotten out, great, get them out of the economy. They're not fighting you. They're not in the economy. And it's not like they're over in Germany protesting for you. Like, we're pro-Russia. Like, very few of them are going to be doing that because they're apathetic, right? So get them out, hurt the economy, keep them from fighting. That's great. Second wave of mobilization that
Sorry
has
for
to come.
interrupting you. There is an air alarm. I just want everybody to listen.
Oh my gosh.
Can you hear it?
Sorry. Yeah, I can hear it. I'm so sorry.
No, you don't have to be you don't have to be sorry, because this is the indication that the air alarm is finished. So basically,
oh, is it?
We started. I just have it on my app, and actually you can see the air alarm is over. You see?
Wow.
So it says the third time for today. Basically, it started like at 10 a.m. It was like for 1.5 hours, then during like the lunchtime, and now. And actually today, Friday, February 10th, was one of the largest massive rocket attacks on our country. I am in Lviv, which is the westernmost city, and 4 rockets that were heading towards our city were shot in the air by defense system. Kyiv received a few destructive hits within the city limits, and cities like Zaporizhia and Kharkiv,
they got nailed.
They received the biggest attack since the start of the war. So only Zaporizhia, only like 17 rockets within 1 hour hit different objects. So that just for everybody to note what is happening now in Ukraine. But since the alarm is off, let's continue.
I mean, I don't know how you live in that kind of scenario. I mean, it's just got to be like on hyper alert constantly. It's just tragic.
To tell the truth, at this stage, we are already almost 1 year in war, and this is actually will be the topic on your channel. Yeah, we are going to record another video on your channel about some outcomes, resolutions, what happens during the entire war in Ukraine. So please, after guys, you will watch this video, hop over on Darin's channel and watch another one where we'll be examining the war of living in Ukraine during the war.
Yep.
The year of living during the war. But I must say, from my perspective, I mean, you get used to it. You get used to it the same as people in the Tornado Valley get used to tornadoes like every other day or so, every other year or so. Or you get used to it like, these crazy hours. It's not to compare with, but staying in traffic for 2 hours every day to me sounds very crazy. Like, I would never live in the conditions where I'm forced to spend 2 hours of my every single day in traffic, for example. Yeah, a very basic explanation, but even like in this scenario, life goes on. It's terrible. It's hard to accept at the first scenarios, but then you carry on. And as for myself, living in a properly functioning city in the West, which is Lviv, these like conditions which are happening in the east of Ukraine, next to everyday bombings, without electricity, gas supply, and water, is like crazy. But I visited those areas, and I have a few videos on my channel about this. People get along, people adjust to it. They don't get used to it, they adjust to it. And that's the unfortunate explanation of human psychology, that very quickly we adjust to good things, but also we adjust to bad things.
Yeah. Wow. I'm trying to remember where we even were after
Sorry
that.
for interrupting you, but I think it was a worthwhile moment to
Yeah.
show how it sounds. Yeah.
Yeah. We were talking about mobilization, and
Mhm.
so I'm happy that those million Russian men fled. I don't want them fighting you, and I don't want them in the country helping the economy. So another wave of mobilization, which has to come because Putin's going to double down. He can't not double down. They're going to close the borders first, and then you're going to see people trying to sneak out of the country as much as they can. And it's got to come because long term, you can't sustain at the rates that there are. Putin doesn't want to do that because he's risk averse and he knows that that's going to create more political instability. And again, his risk averseness, he thought that he was going to knock over Ukraine in a matter of a couple of weeks and just walk right over it and take it. And then he'd have this big prize without any struggle. And you guys defied him, and good on you. It's been as perilous as it's been for you. It has altered the trajectory of geopolitics. So going full circle back to what we were just talking about with, is it an extension of the Cold War? It has just, Putin was trying to reorder the world, and what you did is reorder the reordering, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you've put it back onto the right trajectory. It's like a planet out of orbit, and you put it back into the proper motion. Now it's going to take some adjustment. It's painful. It's terrible. But wow, had he not stopped, what would have happened next? So he takes Ukraine. Moldova's next, certainly.
Baltics
Right?
is next.
I'm sorry?
Baltics would be next.
Yeah, and so that would be kicking. So here's the thing. So you were asking me about the American perspective. It's not monolithic, but it's largely supportive of Ukraine. And so a big chunk, 2/3 of the population are right there with you. There's maybe a third or so that's not, but so when my conservative friends will tell me, and I'm a conservative, right? When my conservative friends tell me, well, I don't want to start World War III, precisely, I don't want to start World War III either. That's why I back Ukraine. You got to stop Putin right now. Keep him from becoming Hitler. Like, that's the point. And so we all want the same thing of not starting World War III. We're quibbling about how to get there. There's not let me add this. There's not a faction in the United States that I'm aware of that is at all interested in like anti-Ukraine. We hate Ukraine. Like there's really not. There's an ambivalent or apathetic side, and then there's there's a little small section, very small, pro-Russia, but those are usually ones that have bought Russian talking points. They're buying the Russian propaganda. They're not realizing they've even imbibed it. That's the misery with RT and Pravda and all the other stuff that comes from Russia, is that people like just accept it without realizing and thinking critically. So I do a segment in mine on Fun with Russian State Media, where I'm just showing like how absurd these claims are compared to what I just showed you. And because I'm trying to like pull the wool back out from the wool's over their eyes. I'm trying to pull it back out. So
thanks for your words. And I think many people don't realize, like especially those like, let's say, peacekeepers, who don't understand like it's all about Ukraine. Like, why you just simply try to negotiate, give a piece of land, and then it will be over and we will all live in a peaceful world again. It's just like, as you told, the same story that goes back to 1938 with the first Czechoslovakia, like soft, first like the Anschluss in Austria, then Czechoslovakia, and then step by step. So at this moment, it's like decisive. You have to push back, and unfortunately, the Russians are this type of psychological type that the only language they understand is brutal power, unfortunately. And since we already talked about the geopolitics of the region around Ukraine, around this like Eastern Europe, I think that there are like certain stages how the situation will develop, and you might give a feedback on that, for example. So first of all, we have to win like the war within the borders of Ukraine and restore the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which means taking back Crimea, which means taking back Donbas. The second stage is taking under control Transnistria, which is like a quasi, like a puppet semi-quasi state of like under Russian umbrella, and Transnistria should become fully back integrated into Moldova, where it belongs to. then I really believe that there will be like really turbulence in Belarus. And
Yeah.
once Ukrainians will prevail, it's like almost guarantee that there will be violence in Belarus. I'm unfortunately to tell this, but there will be the attempts to overthrow regime because, in my opinion, Belarus belongs to the West, and the people of Belarus they simply need more help in this scenario. And in the end of the line, before the final stage, I hope that everybody in NATO and in Europe understand that they have to do something with Kaliningrad Oblast, which is the bomb in the middle of Europe next to the Baltics.
Yeah,
And
next to
there,
Lithuania, and so the Lithuanians didn't want it because there weren't Lithuanians there. The Poles were like, I don't want that, and so it was a spoil from World War II from the
but you
Germans, right?
cannot keep it like this. I mean, you
Yeah, I
have to do
understand.
something. You have to do something that's maybe like some international area under control or special economic zone, but it's impossible simply to leave Kaliningrad there, and it's impossible to show it on the map. Now, just a second, I will try to see it so people understand it. Yeah.
I thought that the Zawalski Pass had a great possibility, if I'm pronouncing it right, that little section in Poland that goes right up to Kaliningrad. I thought that was going to potentially kick off World War III if we were not hyper careful when Lithuania was cutting off transit to it, which seemed pretty fair.
You see, like this part.
Yeah,
it's like former Eastern Prussia, like Eastern, like former German Republic, yeah. But
yep.
since World War II, it belongs to Russia, and you cannot simply keep it like leave it like this in the middle of Europe. You have to do something with this. Otherwise, there's like this. This leaves a slight risk of further escalation, and it will always be this like joker card in the hands of Russians. And then once this is taken care of, I believe the only scenario when Europe, when the region will be like secured, or like it will be possible to provide peace here, is the dissolution of Russian Federation and its current form. Because most people don't realize, but Russia is one of the last true remaining empires out there. Only up to 70% of population of Russian Federation are ethnic Russians. The rest 30 are representatives of different nationalities, mostly of Asian origin. And I believe they also, want a part of autonomy or independence, or they like have these movements of self-identification growing and growing. And I believe in the forthcoming decades, we will see this dissolution process of a last remaining empire. So we'll see how it goes. What can you tell on that?
Okay, so I hadn't really thought about Kaliningrad, but I understand what you're saying. I don't think that the Russians would give that up easily because that's their main port for that kind of, like, it freezes over. If you go further north on the map, it freezes over in the winter. So that really puts them in a pinch. Having the Black Sea port is very important to them as well. So I don't think they'll give it up easily, but everything that we're talking about turns on what happens on the battlefield. If Ukraine wins decisively, then they can have their children back. Like, I mean, this is more than what you were just talking about with the Kaliningrad or whatever else. I mean, stolen children. Like, if my children were lost to me, like somewhere in my own city, I'd be pulling my hair out. If they were deported to another nation, I mean, how unbelievable is that? So you have to actually win on the battlefield so that you can actually get your children back, so that you can get reparations. I think Russian oil money should be all earmarked to rebuild Ukraine until everything is rebuilt up to modern standards. I mean, I think that's what ought to happen here now. That's going to deprive the Russians of a third of their economy. They're essentially a gas station masquerading as a nation, said John McCain, right? So I think that has to happen. Now, I'm actually a little more gloomy in my assessment than you are, not about battlefield success, but I think the longer this goes on, the more of a potential that you have for Russia to break. And if Russia breaks and you have factional warlords, you're not getting those children back. Like, you have to have a decisive victory on the battlefield. to force the current system to work, open up, give our children back, be able to have, international inspectors to do all those things. But if it breaks into factional warlords and you can't get into this territory or that territory, whatever, it's a very, very bad scenario. It's also a very bad scenario for the world. And I think economically, we're going to see them break in the next few months. Not necessarily break down to the point where it's that, but really have a significant break, economic defaults and other things along those lines that are going to make it very difficult. And there's going to be a ripple effect to the rest of the world. Let's not forget that. Okay. So what happens as Russia begins to collapse, we're all tied together now. It's going to hurt all of us simultaneously, but it's going to hurt them more, but so I'm, man, I want it to be.
Do you think like once Ukraine prevail on the battlefield, on the fields of Ukraine, there will be a moment when Russia tells, okay, we pull off, let's stop this, shake hands, and we are fine.
They won't be able to at that point.
What stops them from keeping shooting from Belgorod to Kharkiv as they do every day, which is like less than 1 minute of flight time?
Yeah, I think they'll be in such weakened states that even China will be talking to them behind the scenes like, hey, this isn't going to work. Right. I mean, you guys, you have no missiles left. We're not supplying it to you. Right. I mean, I think the pressure will just be once they're off the battlefield. I don't think they're just going to pick up their ball and go home. I think because Ukraine has to have reparations still. They have to have their children back. They have to have, kidnapped stuff or people or whatever else come back. There has to be a day of reckoning. There'll be an international tribunal. But all of that depends on wins on the battlefield. Without winning on the battlefield, if it just keeps and Putin, I think, is gambling on more time is better for him. I think more time arms the Ukrainians and lowers the amount of ammunition that Russia has. So it's actually good for Ukraine. But it also holds the risk of splintering partners, splintering international partners and waning interest and sour economic conditions causing you, no, just have peace. So he's banking on that latter scenario in order to save himself. That's my estimation. I could be wrong, but that's how I see things.
When was the last time Russia admitted loss in the war and were paying repatriation? Like they can pull inside the territory as much as they have plenty of space to do this, but I cannot see the scenario once it's settled exactly. Was there something after the loss against Japanese in 1905?
So you're raising a really good question, and that goes back to the whole thing that we talked about where we started. We're starting talking about the Cold War. Is this an extension? There was a Russian author. His name escapes me, but this was an article, I think, in Politico about a week ago, where he said, after World War II, the Western Allies buried the Nazis' body. They buried it. They had a funeral. The Germans themselves kicked the body into the grave, and then they covered it up, and it was done. They didn't do the same thing after the Cold War, and a zombie has come back. Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is this inhuman kind of monster that's still kind of thinking that and it keeps going. And I think that was a really interesting scenario. The Japanese unconditional surrender, and they were reformed. Even in the German military, the high road to success in the German military is not through combat arms, it's through bureaucracy. Now, that's really interesting. The Americans and the Brits particularly were insisting on that kind of path, as I understand it. I remember reading this somewhere, and that's really fascinating. So the Russians have to get to a point where they have to say uncle with this, and they can't keep this up at the rate that they're going. They're running out of munitions. They're running out, right? But they can't just let go either. They're kind of really in a bind because, hey, I'm going to look terrible on the world stage. So they can't just withdraw. So they're going to have to amp up. And I think another wave of mobilization is in the cards. And I think that's going to. So I don't know. I mean, I just don't know how it'll all play out. But I want Russia to hold together and have to sign and say, yes, you can have all your stuff back. We open up to international inspections. You can see whatever. You can have the oil revenue to rebuild. I want them to have to get to that place. But again, they have to win on the battlefield. They want a stalemate. They want to have another a larger swath of Donbass over the 8 years so that they can just hold it. And we don't realize that those that are calling for peace are actually saying pro-Russia. And that's very dangerous.
True. We definitely don't want a stalemate. And I'll just give an example. Everybody, like most of my peers, my friends, we are like in the mid-30s and so on. Everyone has a grandfather who was fighting against Soviets just after World War II, especially here in the west of Ukraine, in Lviv, which was incorporated into the Soviet Union after World War II. Like all of our grandfathers were fighting against the Soviet like NKVD all the way up to the middle of the 50s, like as guerrillas, you know. So many people who fight now, they feel this as like the continuation of the work their grandparents were doing.
And in many ways, you're right. Just like the Cold War, it's eerily similar. It's not the same stuff. It's not like you're not fighting against a system that wants to eliminate money and defy capitalism. It's not that anymore. It's not philosophical. It's authoritarian. It's about power. It's not about an ideology in the same way. And does that make sense?
Yeah, it is. And we really see it like, okay, since like it's already so tragic and so many people died, we have to solve it once and for all. Like people, like modern generation of Ukrainians don't want to pass this obligation to our children.
Right.
And like recently I was in this military cemetery. So basically it's not a military cemetery, it's a section in the cemetery where the modern fallen soldiers are buried, and the graves appear there, like fresh graves appear there like every day. And these cemeteries are like in most cities and villages all around Ukraine. Whenever you come, you always see a few people, taking care of graves or crying or putting candle and so on. And I've seen there like a woman of like my age probably feeling sad next to the grave. So I approached her very quietly and so on, and we started a small chat. It appears to be that the grave is the place where her husband is buried, and we talked, and she told like now my husband is gone. We still have 2 children, but I mean we're not going to settle on anything in between, because why all these sufferings are for, and why we pay such a big price. So for many Ukrainians, we really feel like it has to be resolved within this conflict for the next generations, and we don't want to drag it further.
Yeah, I understand. And so Putin seizes on this on the sentiment and conflates nationalists who want their independence with Nazis, and particularly the Bandera, whatever. Okay, Bandera, he's fighting for his independence, right? He was fighting against Stalin because of the Holodomor. And unless you can link these things historically, you don't understand. And so it's a very evil, deceptive way of making his case that, we're just trying to, that's.
I can try to explain here.
Yeah, go ahead.
With more intention, since you mentioned the topic of Bandera, which has a lot of discussion around his personality. And actually, my readers asked me to make a video on Bandera, and I'm going to do this in the nearest future. We have a huge monument of Stepan Bandera in the center of Lviv. And these grandfathers whom I just mentioned, they were actually in UPA, Ukrainian resisting army that Bandera was leading. So, I mean, Bandera is our hero. He's our hero. He's the person who was fighting for independence. He was fighting against Soviets during the time of World War II. And at the same time, he was fighting against the Germans. However, for Russian mindset, everybody who was fighting against them during World War II is a Nazi.
Mm-hmm.
That's the story.
So Bandera is an interesting cat because he was also, wasn't he killed by the Germans or jailed by the Germans eventually?
He was jailed by the Germans, but killed by Russians.
Okay, gotcha.
So, yeah. So I'll tell you also the pretext for this. Yeah. The borders in Eastern Europe before World War II were different than it is now.
Sure.
Poland was more shifted to the east. Now it's like it moved to the west. So basically, to simplify it very well on the Ukrainian land, current western part of Ukraine was under Polish Republic in between the war times. Central part of Ukraine and the east was under the Soviet Union, starting after Russian Revolution and until the start of World War II. Mm-hmm. So when the World War II started, it didn't start by Germany invading Poland. It started by Germany and Soviet Union invading Poland. This is what
right. That's right. And so I've made this point as well that, when they talk about how Bandera was working with the Nazis, so were you. So were the Soviets until Germany double-crossed them. I mean, that is what... Yeah, thank you for pulling that out, because not a lot of people, and this is why this discussion is so important, right? You're talking about is this an extension of the Cold War? You've got to see the whole span of history to understand all these things. Otherwise, you're only looking at one little slice, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. So thank you for pointing that out. That's brilliant.
Here it gets more interesting. Germany and Soviet Union invaded Poland in 1939.
Right.
Very quickly, they settled on the line in the middle, which was signed a few years before that by Molotov-Ribbentrop. Yes, and that's why Eastern Poland and the current Western Ukraine became part of Soviet Union. And the cruelty which Soviets were doing in newly occupied territories were terrible. 100,000s of people executed, sent to Siberia, and so on. So when in 1942 Germany attacked Soviet Union, for many people who already suffered so much from only 2 years of Soviet occupation, it was a chance for the new breath when Germans applied, right? Mm-hmm. And Bandera had for him settling on some kind of agreement with Hitler was a possible chance for future independent Ukraine.
Sure.
It was the game, right? But eventually the Germans didn't let Ukrainian army, Western Ukrainian National Army, to do what they wanted to do, and they sent everybody to jail or to execution camps and so on, And then when the Soviet Union pulled back, attacking Germany and moving west, Western Ukrainian National Army was fighting against Soviets. And, it gets more complicated even mm-hmm. from here. But as I told, from Soviet Union, everybody who was fighting against them is the Nazi.
Yep. Yeah. And the day after Germany double-crossed Russia, or it's the Soviet Union, the day after is when Bandera wrote to Hitler asking for independence. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's that was his motivation. And you have to tell the full story. Hitler was a vegetarian, but that's not the issue, right? I mean, if you just focus on that one little line, vegetarians must be bad. That's kind of what we're doing here, and it's a shame that people aren't hearing the whole story and understanding what's going on.
That is like this. Obviously, there are many more things to discuss about this, but probably we have to wrap up. It's almost an hour of our conversation.
That went quick.
I hope that we will continue because it looks like we have over than 30 people now live. And guys, if you like this, please thumbs up. Feel free to write the comments below. What do you think about the topic of possible extension of the Cold War? And at this time, I would like to thank you, Mr. Gerdes, for this conversation. I'm getting ready to talk on your channel and invite everybody also to subscribe on your channel. Link will be down below. And let's carry on. Let's carry on because the history now is being written over here,
It
and
is.
I really hope that it will be settled as soon as possible.
Me too. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's always good to see you again.
Bye bye. See you.